The millstones seized beneath Edda's hands before she had a full breath. She shoved her shoulder against the wheel frame and felt the whole wooden axle lock, a sound like two dull bones striking. Suspicion tightened in her chest. She had tended this mill through frost and flood, and did not mistake the feel of a stone that should turn. "Rurik," she called without looking up. Breathing flour dust and cold air, the stone's 1T move, she worked by the light that leaked through the narrow window, a single band across the packed floor. Edda paused and pressed both palms to the millstone's lip. Her fingers found a child-sized print pressed into spilled flour on the near side, the toes deep, powder clinging under them. She smoothed flour from her hands and muttered the only practical questions she held. Whose foot, and why here? Suspicion pushed her first decisions. She moved to the gearing. Rurik arrived as the sun threatened the ridge. He came with his leather apron slung off his shoulders, sleeves pushed to reveal soot-smudged forearms. He bent at the shaft and ran a thumb along a scratch gouged into the wood. The grip broke the grain shaft. Something small went in the gears. Edda pointed to the footprint. A child was here last night. Rurik stood and rubbed his jaw with a collused hand. We done to keep children in mill rooms after dusk. Not for the season's grain. They worked in silence for a few measured minutes, turning the axle by hand, testing the wheel, listening to the slow creak of timber. Edda's hands moved with habit, one finger tracing the rim where a chip had been patched, the other testing a bearing. Her movements showed steady concern rather than panic. She kept speaking aloud the practical steps she would take. We drain what's spilled. We'll bag it separate. I'll check the sacks, Rurik's voice lowered. Find anything else. She pointed to a narrow strip of cloth snagged on a cog, its edge frayed and fine compared to peasant's wool. It had a faint dye not common to village work garments. Rurik eased it free with a small knife. He held it up to the window light, and the cloth caught a thread of early sun. This is finer than the market's ordinary. Could be from the castle. Edda's jaw tightened. Grain smeared with a dark streak lay near the hopper, like ink dragged through meal. She pinched a corner and smelled oil and iron beneath the flour. If that smear spread, a season's worth of milled grain might be ruined or rejected. The problem became twofold. A stranger had entered the mill, and the village's livelihood might be damaged. Before they could set a plan, Mara came running up the lane, breath short, cloak whipping with "Do, Edda!" "Rurik," he said, naming them to anchor their attention. "My father's lamb is gone." I found the pen open. Edda shut the mill door with a heel and turned. "How many?" "One. The black one. Gone at dawn. I saw a lantern near the gate last night. It moved toward the castle. I thought at first it was a watchman." Mara's voice trembled in places where he tried to steady it. He set his satchel on a stone and pulled at the strap, fingers finding the carved whistle inside. I left the whistle by the hedge." "It's gone." Rurik crouched and inspected the mill threshold. "Tracks out here are muddied. Follow them and you'll find where feet led." They followed the tracks without delay. The lane held fog low to the ground. Dew flattened straw against cottage doors. Edda moved at the lead, her pace careful so she could see every indentation in the mud. Her suspicion grew into focused attention. She noticed details others might miss. The drag mark by the wheel rut, a faint smear of dye on a hedge leaf, the way a bit of torn cloth caught on a thorn. At the market lane a torn scrap of banner hung flayed on a hawthorn. Edda crouched and took the scrap between two flour-dusted fingers. The woven mark stitched on its edge matched a standard often flown from the castle's gatehouse. She did not say the name of the lord. Instead, she tested the scrap's weight between fingers and let the group see her realization on her face. "That is a banner piece. Rurik, the stitches are neat." "Not a peasant's hand." Mara's eyes widened. "The gate was closed when I went past, Edda. Then someone moved through here who belongs to the castle's order. Or someone took the standard. We need proof." They moved toward the stone bridge with their shoulders pulled in against the mist. Rurik's single-handled hammer thumped once in his palm. He scanned the riverbank as they walked. At the water's edge he found something that shifted the day's suspicion into alarm. A small iron token half, buried in mud. He pried it free. The metal still held faint warmth that rose off it like a breath. The token bore a stamp used by castle attendants, a ring with a wedge mark. Rurik turned it over on his palm and said, "This was hot not long ago. Someone left it here within hours." Edda pressed her thumb to the token's edge. Her lips tightened into a line that measured consequences. If the token belonged to the lord's retinue, the stranger in their village had not been a common thief. The practical stake sharpened. If castle men had been near the huts, a child could have been taken, or something worse done to the stores. They climbed onto the bridge and found a wooden whistle split down the middle. Mara reached for it, fingers hovering over the carved rim. He traced the remaining pattern and said, "My father used to carve whistles like this for the boys." "We made the same pattern." Edda's mouth went thin. She folded the whistle into a small cloth and placed it inside her pouch. Then someone took a familiar boy's token, or the boy himself. "Either way, we have to tell the Reeve." Rurik paused on the parapet and peered toward the castle. A lantern glowed further along the bridge, a single point of amber. It cut the fog for a moment, and then wind stirred and the light guttered. Edda called, "Hello." "Who goes there?" "Show yourself." The lantern bobbed. A cloaked figure stepped forward, the edge of a hood catching a pin of light. For a second they were sure they would meet a man who could answer them. Rurik shifted forward. Mara called out a name he did not know. The wind came down the river and the lantern snuffed as if a hand had passed close. The figure melted into the fog, and the distant iron gate at the castle clanged shut. Silence landed like a weight. Edda felt the shift from alarm toward a tightened resolve beneath her ribs. "We cannot go through the gate, not yet. We take what we found back and prepare." They searched the banks and found only a damp scrap of cloak near a bulrush. It smelled faintly of coal smoke and river weed. Rurik kept the scrap between thumb and forefinger and did not hide his concern. They returned with the whistle, the cloth from the mill, and the scrap. Each item became a proof to hold before the Reeve and the village men. Back in the square, Edda moved quickly. She cleared the ruined flour into separate sacks and sealed them with a strip of oiled leather. Rurik set plans into motion with a series of brisk, efficient orders. "I will make an iron guard for the grain store, a simple bar and latch. It will not stop a lord's men, but it will stop a thief of the common sort." Mara stood with his cloak draped over an arm and watched the two older hands work. Edda felt the shift of fear in him to careful steadiness. He held his satchel in both hands, fingers finding the carved whistle as if to reassure himself. "I'll sit near the east hedge tonight. I can see the road from there." They argued the practical points for 20 minutes. The argument tightened the day's tension into a plan. Rurik insisted they not accuse the castle aloud without proof. "We make a claim, and they'll come with men. We Dunty want our whole lane trampled. Say only what we can prove." Edda looked at Mara. "You saw a lantern. You saw it near the gate. Say that. Describe what you saw." Mara swallowed. "I did. I said the lantern moved toward the castle. I thought it a watchman." Then the gate clanged. They drilled questions and answers into short exchanges. The conversation kept facts sharp and prevented rumor from filling gaps. The practical focus steadied them. This was work to be done, not a tale to tell. Each sentence named a thing. Who, what, when, where. At dusk Edda secured the mill doors with a new peg hammered into place. Rurik took measurements and sketched a simple iron bar with charcoal on a board. Mara fitted his cloak and tightened the cord at his neck until the knot held. The village moved around them with its habitual, quiet noises. A pig complaining, a dog barking once, a door latched. The clouds to the west made the light lean cold. They set a watch rota. Rurik would begin at the smithy after supper and work late to keep the forge lit as a sign and a deterrent. Edda would lock the granary and check the sacks again. Mara would sit on the small hill that overlooked the road and keep his whistle ready. Each choice was a concrete response to the immediate threat. That night they met briefly in the square. Edda handed the split whistle back to Mara. "Keep it wrapped. If you ever hear a sound you do not know, blow once." "Not for me, for the flock," Mara nodded. His fingers found the carved rim and he tucked it into his satchel. "I will watch, Edda. I will watch the road." Rurik's hammer lay across his knee. "If anyone comes with a token like this again, bring it to me. I'll hot stamp it, and you will see the iron mark melt. We will know." They dispersed to their posts with small, determined movements. Edda walked back to the mill and checked the patched stones again. She ran a palm along the gear where the strip of cloth had stuck. The cloth's dye smudged faintly on her fingertips. She cleaned it carefully and placed the scrap inside her pouch with the whistle and the warm token. A minor revelation arrived with Mara's next report at dusk. The raw wool at the shepherd's gate had been pushed aside with a boot that left a heel mark unlike the common peasant shoe. Edda and Rurik examined it under a lamp and found a metal shank in the heel. That concrete detail changed a loose suspicion into a surer understanding. The party who moved through the village wore clothes finer than peasants and footwear fitted to metal functions. The twist made their plan more urgent. Rurik and Edda argued for one more small change: if they take to moving in coats and tokens. Rurik: "They can still be turned back by showing the grain guard and a bright forge. People follow strength and simple shows of readiness." Edda tightened the strap on the grain sack and nodded. "We will not shout about the castle. We will show we guard our own." The mid-chapter moment came as a raw cliff. Someone hammered at a cottage door 2 lanes over. The sound cut across the hush of late evening. Mara froze on the hill and blew once on his small whistle. The sharp single note rolled down the lane. Edda heard it and ran. Rurik set his hammer down and shouldered for the door with a lantern. They found only the Reeves man who had stopped to borrow bread for a sick child. He apologized and offered a handful of barley to the mill. The false alarm left a taste of adrenaline that would not wash away. It forced them to test their readiness. They had to move, speak, and act on short notice. Each small failure taught them where their plan had loosened. The next morning they tried to pick apart the token's origin by visiting the castle's servants' market. They traded no accusation. Instead, Rurik tradesman about any lost tokens. A woman who mended banners sat with rows of neat stitches. She recognized the woven mark. It belonged to the standard used by the steward's younger attendants. "They often ferry packets at dusk," she said, naming a schedule that matched Mara's sighting. Rurik's jaw worked. The woman widened her hands, "But they do not bring boys." Edda listened and kept her face practical. She wrote a short note asking the Reeve to check the steward's ledger if he would. She folded the note and handed it to the woman to pass. Actions, not slogans. A small twist arrived before they could secure any record. A child from a cottage near the east hedge said he had been called by a voice that sounded like the stewardess' servant. The man promised a coin and left a folded strip of cloth at the hedge as a lure. The child's report made a clear change in how Edda understood the night's events. It was not merely a patrol passing. Someone had deliberately lured a familiar boy. Suspicion now grew into the shape of intent. Edda felt the final shift of emotions into a reserved, practical resolve. She no longer simply feared. She organized. She called the Reeve at mid-morning and delivered their proofs. The whistle, the token, the cloth, a child's account. The Reeve, a man accustomed to weighing words, read each item slowly and asked questions that Edda answered with facts. She kept her voice flat where passion would have sent the claims soar. By late afternoon they had done what they could. The Reeve promised a formal visit to the gate at dawn to inquire about the stewardess' attendance. He would not send a large party that night. The Lord's household moved on schedule, and men drawn out without cause could make a scene. The village accepted that, and the decision required them to keep watch on their own. Edda secured the final peg in the mill door, and then stood in the square with Rurik and Mara for one last look. The castle's silhouette was a cut of stone against the low sky. It did not feel like menace, only like an institution that moved men for reasons they did not always share. Edda put the whistle and the cloth into the mill's small locked chest, and laid the warm token on top, where it would be seen. Rurik folded his arms and tested the angle of his hammer against a post. We do what we can. We keep tools. We tell the reeve. We watch. Mara hugged his cloak to his chest and took one more look down the road he would sit beside that night. He squared his shoulders in a way that made Edda note him differently. The boy's worry had become purposeful duty. They separated to their posts. Edda spoke once, in a short sentence that carried the plan. Tonight we watch. Tomorrow we bring accounts to the gate, Rurik nodded. Mara tightened his satchel strap and began the slow climb to the hill. The last image of the chapter is concrete. Mara sitting with his cloak over his knees, the carved whistle hidden in cloth, eyes on the road, listening for lanterns and footfalls, while Edda locks the mill and slides the key into her pouch. Mara tightened the cloak and began his watch on the hill. Edda grabbed the mill gate and felt the wool snag against iron. A small child's cloak clutched to the bolt by a finger of mud. Suspicion pressed at her ribs. She had felt that same wrongness when the millstone seized the week before, and now the cloth proved something had been taken. She called out, voice flat and steady, and Rurik's footfalls came up the yard before Mara's softer steps. Rurik, she said, holding the wet fabric so he could see. This was by the wheel. Edda's hands moved on habit, palms dusting flour from the linen strap of her apron as she held the cloak by its torn sleeve. She had kept the mill turning through frost and thaw. The wheel had stuck that night. She remembered the wooden axle groan, the way she shoved her shoulder, and the whole frame answered like two dull bones striking. That memory made the present discreet and urgent. A missing child could not be shrugged away. Edda's suspicion shaped her choices. She set the cloak against a post and pointed with her jaw toward the lane. Tracks, she said, boot prints and a smear of wool. Toward the ford, Rurik crouched with his palms on the ground. He traced the shoe marks with one sooty finger. Mounted, he said. He tapped a crescent-shaped indentation in the mud, castle pattern, 5 nails broad toe. Not a trader's pony. Mara stood with his cloak still damp from her hands, looking at the river line, then at the tracks. Could be a thief. Mara, voice small. But why take a child? Edda did not answer with a theory. She pushed open the mill gate and put the cloak inside the wheelhouse for a moment, then shut it and ran her thumb along the torn hem. She moved briskly because indecision would let the track wash or vanish. The 3 of them set off along the lane as the sky paled. Their steps kept time with the edge of panic that sharpened in Edda's jaw. She breathed through it, naming it in her body. Suspicion tightened, then edged toward a hot steadiness that made her feet deliberate. At the lane they met the village reeve and old Hilda. The reeve came with a frown and a staff. Hilda's voice rode on a thin breath of complaint, a soldier at market. Hilda, before they could ask, my granddaughter saw him near the stalls. Little one, didn't he come home? The reeve examined the cloak without touching it, and then looked to Edda. We need proof before we march on the yard, he said. We cannot accuse the garrison on rumor. Edda met his eye. We found the cloak on the mill gate and boot marks to the ford, she said. There are hoof prints. Rurik says the horses match the castle pattern, Rurik added. There's a smear of coarse wool along the wheel frame. Shows it brushed here. Someone took the child from the lane or nearer. Hilda muttered. The banners were up yesterday. I heard trumpets at dusk. The reeve's face tightened. I'll sound men if needed. But first, the ford. Come with me and point us to what you found. They walked toward the river in a thin fog that clung to cobbles. Edda kept the cloak folded against her chest. The fabric smelled of damp and straw. When they reached the approach to the stone bridge, Rurik stopped and crouched again. He probed a horseshoe mark with his heel, and then ran his thumb through the mud beside it. "That shape," he said. "The rim is rounded inside. Castle Farrier uses this iron. See the nail spacing." Edda leaned down and touched the print. Her fingers found cut grass and a torn reed. "Mounted through the marsh, not the main road," she said. "Why would a rider take that route?" Mara pointed at the culvert where the bridge's stones met the water. "These reeds are trampled wrong. Like someone dragged something in here," he said. He crouched, thumbed at flattened stems. "Ivad, someone pulled it under." The reeve frowned. "We cannot face soldiers without more. I'll go to the green and ask for help. Stay and watch the ford." "Report back." Before he could move, the watchman from the far bank stepped out of the mist and leaned on his spear. He was a broad-shouldered man with a wool cap. His hands smelled of river oil. "What trouble is this?" the watchman asked. Edda held up the cloth, a child's cloak. "We think someone from the castle passed over the bridge." The watchman blinked and clasped his chin. "I saw riders. I did not see a child." "I swear it." Rurik's jaw thinned. "Then tell us which way." "Which guard? You keep watch." "You saw men. Were they full armor or just surge?" He hesitated, half gear. "One lad with a brass bit at his throat. He carried a small ring." Mara crouched more and pushed his head under the bridge lip to peer into the culvert. He came back with a line of breath. "Reeds gone down. Stones scraped here. Something was dragged beneath the arch." The watchman's posture shifted. He glanced at the castle on the ridge and then away. "I can say more." "Orders." Rurik stood and said. "Orders or fear. If you hide this, then your orders made you part of it." The watchman bristled. "Dunty, you name me that. Smith. I keep my wits about me." Edda stepped between them and laid a flat palm on Rurik's forearm. Her movement eased the edge. "Rurik, we do not need to close mouths. We need to open them. Ask him what he saw exactly." Rurik gave a short nod and spoke slow. "Which way pulled? Left bank or right? Which reed line? Which guard had a ring? Tell me the ring." The watchman's jaw worked. He spat on his boot and pointed at a dull crescent mark on a coin he kept behind his ear. "A small rusted ring tied to a ribbon," he said. "A soldier had it." He crossed alone near dawn. Edda felt a slide of fear then, but she did not name it. Her hands went quick, fingers brushing the cloak, then closing around a small folded scrap of ribbon the child had. She hadn't noticed it before, tied to a rusted ring. The ribbon's color had faded to an ash of red where it had been in sun. Someone had knotted it to a ring that matched the watchman's description. They moved on to the bridge and Rurik found a coin near the parapet, its face stamped with the castle's sigil. Edda's fingers trembled as she lifted it. The coin sat warm with river damp. "This came from the castle," she said. She felt an old anger harden. Not loud, not theatrical, but precise, the way a hurled wheel might split a beam. The suspicion that had begun in her chest tightened into a small, hot resolve. They could not let this pass as mischance. They argued then about what to do. "The reeve, we must muster men and present proof to the castellan. We are not soldiers. We need the town behind us." Edda answered in short, clipped lines. "If we wait, the child moves farther. If we go alone, we risk being driven off. If the castle hides its men, there will be no proof later." Rurik rubbed his knuckles with his thumb. "I can follow their trail under cover. Mara can come with me. We want to look like searching. Then we report back." The reeve stared. "You two against soldiers." "I won't have that on my head." Rurik shot back. "You won't have it if you send men to the green now. Done stand with your hands clean. Send them." Edda's voice cut in, low, measured. "Reeve, send 2 lads to muster men. I'll hide the ribbon. If Rurik and Mara find more, they circle back. If not, they call from the ford. We do not charge the yard alone." There were quick lines then, 3 or 4 short exchanges where the reeve barked and Rurik pushed and Mara stayed quiet but alert. "Hilda, if a child was taken, we cannot wait." The reeve shifted, then nodded once. "I'll call men. Go now." Don T. Dawdle, Rurik and Mara slipped downstream along the riverbank, keeping low behind hedgerows and cart-worn turf. Edda watched them go until they were a pair of pale smudges. She crouched then and folded the ribbon into the palm of her hand, pressing it where her fingers could hide it in her apron. Her movements had a blunt, practical slowness, fold, press, tuck, actions that felt like decisions. She ran to the culvert mouth where Rurik had been and peered into the low dark. Stones made a low tunnel, and the smell of river rot and iron came up. Edda could see the scrape marks inside the mortar, a line of scuffed grit where something heavy had been drug. That sight sent her forward with a brief stab of nausea, a tightened throat and a hand at her belt for steadiness. A faint sound came from within, like cloth rubbing stone. Edda's muscles tightened. Her first reaction was to call for aid. She forced her voice down to a steady note. "Rurik." "Mara!" Rurik's muffled reply came from deeper inside. "Hold. We hear movement." Edda moved to the culvert lip and looked around. The watchman kept his back stiff to the castle bank. He had not come closer. The reeve had walked to the village green to call men. Edda could hear a faint crunch of boots in the distance. Helda had taken a step back, fingers twisting a shawl. The world was composed of small concrete things. A torn hem, a horseshoe print, a coin stamped with a crest. Those things demanded actions. Mara's head finally appeared from the low gap, his hair damp with river mist. He looked as if he had tried to crawl and swallowed grit. "There's a hollow," he said. "Boots in there. A child's small boots." Blood on a rag. Edda's breath left shorter. Her hands went automatic, lifting from her apron to steady Mara's shoulder. "Can you see beyond the stones? Can you hear a voice?" Mara nodded, a murmur like someone breathing. Not a child's laugh. Rurik's reply arrived thin and sharp. "We should not rush. If there is a man there, if it's a guard with orders, they'll fight. We need more hands." Edda swallowed the urgent anger that wanted action now. She felt the emotion shift, suspicion to rising fear to a controlled resolve. She named each in small moves. She pressed the ribbon deeper into her pocket. She stepped back from the culvert and called Hilda close. "Hide the cloak in the storehouse," she said. "Leave a thin trail back. If they come searching, they will find nothing." Hilda hesitated, then obeyed, fingers trembling as she took the wet fabric. The reeve lowered his head and began to shout toward the green. Voices started to answer him, men moving feet toward a summons. The urgency in the village changed gear. Rurik and Mara crawled out and sat on the stones, both quiet for a moment. Mara's face had a pale dusting where he had brushed against the culvert floor. Rurik wiped his forearm with the heel of his hand and chewed his lower lip. "We saw small boots, Rurik, a child's size. Old shoes, not new," Mara added, "and kitchen spoons, a basin. They dragged household things through." Edda's jaw set. A new thought edged into her. A deliberate taking rather than a theft of goods. That thought was a twist, proof that transformed the problem from a random raid into something planned. She looked at Rurik. If the castle took a child and kept things here, they know it's on their route. They are hiding evidence. Rurik's fingers tightened on his hammer loop. "Then we present this. We show the coin, the ribbon, the boots. The reeve will not be able to ignore the trail once men bring it forward." There was a sudden sharpness in the reeve's voice from the green. He had gathered 3 able men, and they were halfway across the common. A shout from the green carried, "To the bridge! Bring torches! Bring ropes!" Edda felt the final emotion shift settle into place. The initial suspicion, the hot spike of fear, then a blunt steadiness that made decisions simple. Act, collect proof, do not charge blind. She took the ribbon from her pocket for the briefest of seconds, then passed it to Rurik to hold, where more hands could see it when the reeve returned. She explained in short clipped sentences how to lay out the evidence and where to find the child's boots under the culvert stones. They worked quickly. Men arrived with rough ropes and torches. Hilda's voice counted the names of those who came. The reeve set the proofs on a flat slab and called the village together in a voice that made men stop and look. Rurik spoke first, placing the coin on the stone and saying, "This came from the castle. We found it on the bridge. A child's ribbon was tied to it. There are small boots in the culvert." Voices rose then, questions and angry mutters. The watchman on the far bank tightened his grip on his spear and looked away toward the castle. The reeve, with the proof spread out, did not yet shout an accusation. He folded his arms and measured the men with his eyes. "We will not burn bridges with empty claims," he said finally. "But we will not let a child be taken without answer. We carry this to the castellan. 2 of you will go as an envoy, present this proof. If they refuse to act, we will take our case before the steward and the bailiff." Edda caught Rurik's eye and saw the worn patience in his face sharpen into something like fury. He spoke in a voice that was low but steady. "I will go with you, reeve. I will not have this sweep past us." The reeve nodded. "Then you 2 go. Mara will remain to watch the ford and retrieve the child's boots with us. Edda, stay here and keep the evidence safe until we return." Edda felt the weight of the decision anchor into her shoulders. She had wanted to move and pull the matter into action herself. Instead, she kept the practical center. She wrapped the cloak and the coin in clean linen and pushed them into a chest on the mill floor, then sealed it with a strap. She tied a small mark of her own to the strap. A nicked loop of reed knotted twice so she could prove where the cloth had been kept. The men left at a steady pace, 2 to the castle as envoys, others to muster at the green. Mara stood with a hand on the bridge rail, watching the trail the riders had made toward the ford. Rurik paused at the mill gate and looked back once. He saw Edda place the lid on the chest and press her palm to the wood. He nodded, a short motion like a struck bell. Edda's last action before the reeve's party passed out of sight was to slip the child's ribbon into the small cloth pouch at her waist. She did not speak. She folded her hands and cleaned the flour from between her fingers. The village began to gather proof and voice at once, their steps toward the green, the sound of ropes coiling, the clink of a spade. There was a resolution in those ordinary noises. It was not a triumph, it was a movement. When the envoys reached the foot of the castle road, a guard came out and barred their way. The reeve held the coin and the ribbon and spoke with a clear surety. "We bring proof of a taken child. Open your gate and let our men speak with the castellan." The guard hesitated and then turned, moving with the slow certainty of men who knew how to delay. Behind them in the village, the mill door shut. Edda remained with the chest and the scent of flour and water. She listened for the sound of feet returning, for names called, for the reeve's voice. The final beat of the chapter lands on that concrete sound. The echo of distant men's boots as they walked toward the castle, the mill door latched, the ribbon safe in her pouch. And the reeve's shout heard faintly as they step up the hill. The immediate threat had not been solved, but the village had gathered its proof and chosen action. They had made a plan and set others into motion, and Edda braced herself to wait and to act when the next decision arrived. The constable shoved his lantern into the smithy yard and named the thefts aloud. "Grain and a lamb taken from the castle stores," the constable said. Suspicion tightened around Rurik's shoulders before his hands left the hammer. The constable's voice made a list. He set a deadline for the village. Return the goods, or market privileges and sanctuary would be limited. Rurik stepped forward. He wiped coal from his forearm and met the constable's eyes. "Rurik the smith," the constable said. Villagers pressed at the gate. Mara stood at the smith threshold with mud on his boots. Edda walked up the lane with a flour smear across her sleeve. The problem was clear. The village could lose trading rights if the castle pressed sanctions. Suspicion is the root that drives this chapter. Rurik feels it as a physical weight in his palms. Edda recognizes it as the wrongness she felt when the millstones seized weeks earlier. Mara registers it as a tightness in his throat when he thinks of the missing lamb. that suspicion pushes them to act. They argue. They search. They make choices. The constable kept his lantern close. He pointed at Rurik's anvil. "Proof hangs in your hammer marks," the constable said. A sergeant near him added a thin warning about merchants and tolls. Voices rose. "Not my doing," Rurik answered. "I would not jeopardize the market. Edda, we keep the mill and forge working for everyone. Mara." An immediate alarm altered the morning. A villager shoved through the crowd and shouted that a child's cloak had been found on the bridge. Edda recognized the wool and the notch in the fabric. She remembered the ribbon on the bridge from days before. The memory of the snagged wool returned as a concrete thing, the same mud, pressed corner, and the child a small stitch. That earlier discovery tied the two incidents together for her. She so aloud. Edda crouched, examining the torn lining. Her fingers left pale flour on the cloth. "This lining is stitched with an odd thread," she said. "Not our usual twine." She smelled damp wool and old smoke. Rurik ran a thumb across a horseshoe on his workbench and felt a dent that looked similar to the mark on the found shoe. The constable frowned and called for answers that sounded like orders. They followed the mud trail away from the smith in a slow, practical line. Mara led because he saw far across fields and kept his head for tracks. He tended to avoid the puddles and pointed at scuff marks where a sack might have brushed a cobble. They found small signs, a dropped scrap of rope, a partial hoofprint, a smear of grain on a doorstep. Each sign shifted their feelings. Suspicion became doubt, then sharpened to mistrust when the grain smear matched sacks from the castle store. Mara whispered, "That hoofprint is fresher than the others." Rurik answered, "It leads from the lane, toward the side sheds." He did not shout. His voice was the slow cadence of a man used to measuring beats by hammer strikes. Edda adjusted her shawl and listened to the village, children calling, a cart creaking, a hen squawking, and counted those noises as business that must continue. They reached a half-hidden side shed behind a brewer's house. The door hung askew. Mara slipped through the gap and found a pile of sacks. Grain spilled like a pale river across the floorboards. On top, a small forged horseshoe lay with a stamped mark. Mara called out with a dry voice, "Rurik, a shoe with a maker's mark." Rurik pushed past him, hands already starting to check the stamp. He held the shoe beneath the lantern. The stamped mark had been smoothed and recut. Someone had tried to imitate Rurik's symbol. That discovery moved suspicion into anger. Rurik's jaw clenched. He ground his thumb into the leather and then forced his hands to steady. Edda moved quickly. She pocketed 2 sacks of grain into a hidden niche and snapped the shed door shut. "We should not leave this where the constable will find it first," she said. "If we can show it was hidden and later planted, maybe we buy time." Her manner was brisk. Her hands worked to cover what could be defended. The constable arrived with more men from the gate. He demanded the shed be opened. The sergeant spoke of deadlines and fines. Villagers lined the path to the road in a steady, anxious row. Edda lifted her chin. "Open it with witnesses," she said. "We will not have things taken at night and blamed on the few who keep our tools." The constable's lantern light flickered across faces. At the armory the noise carried differently. Metal shelves and the smell of oil filled the room. Rurik presented the horseshoe. The armorer turned it over with practical gestures. "This is imitation work," the armorer said. He tapped the stamp and showed them a small irregularity. "A true mark would hit here. This one has been filed down and retouched." Someone wanted blame to point here. His certainty shifted the villagers' feeling again. What had been anger toward Rurik turned toward a larger injustice. The armory yielded an unexpected witness. A young page arrived, eyes darting, carrying a small packet. He stood stiff as a pole when Rurik plainly about movement between gate and village at odd hours. "I trade small things sometimes." The page said in a voice thin with fear, "Sacks for small comforts." "I meant no harm." The armorer's face closed. The constable's expression tightened. Conversations shortened into clipped questions. The page's admission raised different reactions. Some villagers met him with immediate hostility. Others, like Edda, measured the words, "You traded sacks of grain." She asked, "With whom?" Edda's voice contained a factual edge. She kept her hands free to show she did not threaten. The page stammered and named a clerk from the castle who had taken payment for silence. The lord's house was short and needed to balance ledgers, the page said. Rurik took the page's statement and pushed for more. "Name the clerk." "Rurik, tell us when." The page named the clerk and described a time when the river was high and fewer guards stood the gate. He mentioned a ledger kept in a locked box and a debt the clerk feared to show his master. That detail revealed motive. A hidden debt inside the castle had sent its agents into the village for grain and flocks. As noon passed, the village divided. The constable wanted a public confession to appease the castle. Villagers argued about trusting the constable. Edda kept covering the vulnerable stores, moving pots and sacks to safer spots. Mara ran errands, his voice short and practical, when he reported each new finding. Mara slipped away to the bridge where the ribbon had been found. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The ribbon, a child's tie, had been a small sign earlier. He found new traces. A footmark on the wet stone, a faint smear of ink from a clerk's hand on a paper left near the parapet. Mara called for Edda and Rurik. "There's sink on the railing," he said. "A clerk's seal could leave this." He brushed the wet mark with his thumb and held it up. They planned a direct approach. Rurik would go to the armory to get witness testimony and compare tools. Edda organized the villagers to secure their food and reported to the constable what she had covered. Mara would keep watch at the lane and the bridge. The plan carried both urgency and caution. Each choice displayed how the trio used practical measures rather than speeches. Morning had given way to afternoon. Rurik walked into the castle gate with calm steps that belayed the storm outside. He carried a spare hammer and the forged shoe. The gate guard let him pass on the strength of his trade good. At the armory, the armorer repeated his finding and added that a clerk's ledger had ledger lines matching a pattern of small sacks moved across the last month. A page stood nearby and swallowed hard when Rurik if he had seen exchanges. When Rurik came back to the village, he found the constable arguing with the sergeant near the market cross. Voices rose in short, sharp lines. The constable wanted arrests. The sergeant wanted to avoid scandal. Villagers pressed close, listening for how the castle would punish them. Edda moved stones to block access to a storeroom and spoke to the women gathered there. "We will not be left without grain when the frost comes," she said. Her words were factual and urgent. At the river bridge in the afternoon, a clerk tried to slip by with 2 sacks on a cart. Rurik, Edda, and Mara stopped him. The clerk's face went pale when Rurik named him. "You there, stop, Rurik, by the bridge, stay." The clerk stalled, and then a scuffle started. The clerk tried to move the cart. The page appeared beside them and held back, eyes wide. Words turned to shoves. The clerk struck at Rurik's elbow. Rurik grabbed the cart's rim. Edda moved forward and pulled at the cart cloth. Mara lunged to block the clerk's path. Voices rose in short exchanges. "Let go." The clerk hissed, "You took sacks." "Rurik, I was ordered." The clerk said, "Who ordered you?" "Edda, the steward," the clerk said, and then he faltered. 3 villagers seized the moment and dragged open the sack. Grain spilled, pale and dusty, across the stones. A lamb bleated from under a loose cloak. The clerk's hands shook. He tried to speak. The page stepped forward, and with a voice that trembled, named the steward and described how the clerk had taken goods under private instruction to cover a debt. The clerk's explanation crumbled into short fragments. "It was to pay a debt at the manor," he said. "He me to take care. No one must know. He promised a note would follow. I did not think." The confession changed everything at once. Villagers reacted with gasps and hands on hips. The constable came running to the bridge and saw the cart, the spilled grain, the lamb blinking. He had to reconcile his duty to the castle with the evidence before him. The sergeant watched the steward's name as if seeing a new face for the castle's misdeeds. Rurik did not act like a man seeking vengeance. He steadied his hands on the cart and asked questions in short lines. Who signed the note? He asked, where is this ledger? The clerk stammered. A seal was used. The clerk said. That detail led them back to the armory where the armorer had already noticed the imitation mark. The stitch in Edda's hand and the clerk's ink on the bridge fit together now. The constable's voice dropped into a practical tone. We will bring witnesses to the steward and demand the accounts be shown, he said. He looked at the villagers and added, if it is as reported, the steward will answer. If not, we will be accused of theft again. He sounded as if choosing the lesser embarrassment for the castle was a duty. The steward came to the gate by dusk, unwilling and pale. He wore the Manus colours, but had a tight look about his jaw. A small crowd assembled on the common. The steward tried to speak around the accusations. Villagers cut in with short, direct lines. You took what fed our market, Edda. You left us at the mercy of the tolls. The steward's answers as fell into fragmentary excuses. The steward's ledger was opened in front of witnesses. The armourer and the page testified. The ink on the bridge matched the clerk's writing in the ledger. The horseshoe with the imitation mark matched a pattern of planted evidence. The steward's mouth worked without producing a coherent defense. He had used his clerk to move goods under instruction, and then filed the accounts in a way that hid the transfers. Anger swelled in some villagers. Others stayed methodical. Edda ordered the grain we had taken from the shed be returned openly, and called for the steward to sign a public record. Rurik kept his voice even while he demanded that the armory inspect any further stamped pieces. Mara stood with the lamb and watched faces pass by. When the steward realized he could not hide his moves, he pleaded for mercy. The constable faced a choice: arrest the steward and send a scandal up the road, or negotiate a return and a public record that would protect the village. The sergeant advised caution. The constable chose to press the steward into a signed repayment and the restoration of the goods, plus a promise in open record to stop private requisitions. He threatened sanctions if the steward failed. That decision settled the immediate danger. The market would keep its privileges as long as the steward followed the signed terms. The steward left under the sergeant's escort. The constable addressed the villagers with a clipped statement and then left toward the gate. The crowd broke apart slowly. Evening came with practical tasks. Edda cooked a small pot and threaded the lamb's tether back to a pen. She closed the shed and checked the mill gates. Rurik stayed up later than usual, running one final test hammer blow to make sure his mark was different. He breathed out once after the work and rubbed a line of soot from his brow. Mara walked the lanes, checking doors and making sure each household had a small measure of grain for bread. There were shifts in feeling across the night. Suspicion had become doubt. Doubt grew into focused anger at the steward, and then eased into a guarded relief when the goods returned. Each change showed physically. A hand clenched, a breath held, a shivered shoulder settling. Each character acted through those small motions rather than long speeches. A final twist appeared as they counted spoons in the common. An envelope fell from the steward's cloak, unnoticed until Mara kicked it with a boot. Inside was a note signed by a minor scribe in the manor, and a list of names of those who had been paid in small trinkets for silence. The list included one name the villagers did not expect, a merchant who handled toll records at the gate. That discovery changed the villagers' view. It shifted responsibility outward and promised more reckonings to come. Rurik, Edda, and Mara met on the stone bridge as twilight drew cold lines across the water. They spoke in short sentences about what to do next. We have the signed terms, Edda. We have grain back in the store. We must watch the merchant's ledger. Rurik. We keep an eye on the steward's movements, Mara added. Their plan was concrete and immediate. The chapter ends with a clear, concrete beat. The constable left orders for a public record to be filed at dawn. The steward agreed, under threat, to restore what he had taken and sign the ledger. Edda bolted the mill gate and set a new padlock. Rurik hammered a fresh maker's mark into a spare shoe and showed it to the armorer. Mara led the recovered lamb down to the pasture and unhooked its tether. The village exhaled through hands that still shook slightly. They had resolved the theft, named the responsible parties, and secured the village's immediate safety. The decisions at the bridge had forced an answer and left the village with a ledger and a watchfulness that would matter in colder months. That night the millstones turned again, the smith's forge cooled under a careful routine, and Mara's lamb slept in a pen with a fresh straw bed. The final measure of the morning's choices sat in the ledger at the gate, and the signed promise in the steward's pocket. The village would measure its safety in returned sacks and public records. The chapter closes on the practical scene of the constable posting the signed terms at the market cross, the ink drying as villagers filed past to read what had been agreed. The recorded lines on the paper were a concrete end to the day's conflict rather than a speech or a vow.